I'm Rachel Morgan. 33 years old, and 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mother called to say I wasn't welcome at the family table because my job would make my sister look small. I was standing in my classroom storage closet, still holding a box of crayons, when her words landed like a door closing in my ear. Samantha's new boyfriend, a man with a name that opens ballroom doors, would be there, and they didn't want a kindergarten teacher lowering the shine. I said nothing dramatic. I just watched the hall clock and listened to children laughing outside my door. What my mother didn't know was that I had a key in my desk, one that opened more than a safe. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had someone decide your worth before they learned your story. I grew up on the far side of the Queensboro Bridge in a narrow house that smelled like Sunday sauce and laundry soap, where our grandmother Grace Whitaker taught us to return the shopping cart, hold the door, and count every dime twice. Grace never spoke about money as a measure of people. She talked about it the way gardeners talk about rain, useful when it falls, dangerous when it floods. She moved into a small room at Sunny Pines when her knees gave out, and I rode the bus every Sunday to play cards, read mail, and listened to stories about the years she worked 2 jobs and slept with a ledger under the pillow. Samantha came when she could, which usually meant holidays, heels clicking down the hall, soft voice asking about dates for a will she hadn't seen. Those visits were brief. Mine stretched until the hallway lights dimmed and the nurse tapped her watch. By the time I turned 28, I knew how to stretch a paycheck to the last Tuesday, how to turn a classroom corner into a reading nook with butcher paper and donated pillows, and how to hear a 5-year-old's apology when all they had to offer was a crumpled drawing. The parents at dismissal thanked me with coffee gift cards. The district thanked me with a salary that covered half my 1-bedroom and a MetroCard that always seemed to run out a day early. Samantha's world moved different. She lived on the 32nd floor of a glass tower where the doorman learned your name and the elevator forgot the lower buttons existed. She measured months in launches and galas. I measured them in bulletin boards and book fairs, hands full of glue sticks, head full of lesson plans. At home, the scales were never even. My mother posted photos of Samantha's awards and boardroom smiles, her captions full of bright words and future plans, while my own milestones grants, one kid's reading above grade level, sat politely off to the side. If I appeared in family photos at all, it was usually with a casserole half in the frame, the kind of picture you scroll past on your way to something shinier. My father wasn't unkind. He was practical in a way that left dents. He believed in status the way some people believe in weather reports. You plan around it and hope you stay dry. When Samantha mentioned Jonathan Hale's name on a Sunday call, my mother's voice went airy and thin, the way it used to when she talked about the ocean. Old family, she said. A foundation. The kind of man who shakes hands with hospital wing donors. I wiped glue from my fingers and waited for my cue. The call that cut me out of Thanksgiving came during my lunch break, and if there's anything I'm grateful for now, it's that the window showed the playground. Nothing interrupts humiliation like a child tackling the monkey bars for the first time. My mother spoke briskly the way she rearranges furniture when company's coming, moving me out of sight with careful hands. Samantha needs a certain impression, she said. A room like that notices jobs, clothes, the shape of a life. I knew what she meant without her saying it plain. In the silence that followed, I pictured Grace at her tiny table adding up receipts, reminding me that money is a mirror. It shows you exactly who you already are. I told my mother I understood, and in a way I did. People who fear smallness build rooms that make others feel small. After school, I walked the 4 blocks home, heat rising from the subway grates, a paper turkey feather tucked into my coat from a child who'd pressed it there with both hands. Inside my apartment, I set the feather on the counter and pulled the safe from the closet. The box came from Grace's old house, the paint worn smooth where her thumb had learned the lock. She'd given me the key on a rainy Sunday, not as an event, but as a habit. Here, honey, put this somewhere, you won't forget it. Back then, I thought it guarded recipes and a few savings bonds. I didn't tell anyone when I learned different. 2 years earlier, after the funeral, lilies wilted and the food was picked over. Arthur Bennett, a man whose suits looked older than my degree, had asked me to sit down in a room lined with law books. He showed me a foundation I hadn't known by name, a set of bylaws that sounded like grace, and a responsibility that felt like a coat I didn't yet fill. I kept working. I kept quiet. I kept Sunday afternoons for letters and spreadsheets that no one knew crossed my kitchen table. The contrast between my life and Samantha's started to feel like a camera lens, one side sharpening, the other softening until you couldn't even tell it was the same family picture. When Samantha called to share details about a Thanksgiving menu that glittered dropping the word plaza and black tie and board, I said I hoped it was everything she wanted. She laughed, and for a moment I heard the storm night little sister who used to climb into my bed, not the woman who measured rooms by, who looked back at her. Then she mentioned a guest list, and the temperature of the call changed. My mother's pause did the talking. I filled the space by looking at my classroom calendar and circling a date no one else had marked. At school the next morning, I read The Little Red Hen with my class and watched their heads tilt the same way Grace's did when she listened for the shape of a person's heart. It wasn't resentment I felt. It was the clean, steady feeling of a boundary you finally touch with both hands. The more I thought about sitting quietly in a side chair while someone introduced me as Les, the more the idea formed of a room where everyone in the photograph had names, not labels. I didn't plan revenge. I planned daylight. Grace always believed that the simplest way to show worth was to do the work in front of you and let the record speak. That afternoon, while the kids napped on mats lined up like little boats, I wrote down 3 sentences on a sticky note and slid it into my wallet beside a faded picture of Grace at a folding table, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp. They weren't words for anyone else. They were a promise to remember what I already knew. Thanksgiving would come whether I was at that table or not. The city would dress itself in early darkness and Samantha's world would clink like glass, and my world would smell like takeout and construction paper and washable markers. Somewhere between those 2 rooms, a door would open that had nothing to do with place settings. I didn't know then who would walk through first, only that the moment was coming. I unlocked the safe, lifted the lid, and laid my hand on the envelope with Grace's name pressed into the seal, the paper warm from the lamp. When the phone rang again, I let it go to voicemail and listened to the tiny hum of the building, certain of one thing only: the next conversation would not happen in a room where I had to ask for a chair. The day after that phone call, the November air had turned brittle, the kind that makes every breath sting a little. The leaves along the curb had gone from amber to gray, and the city felt tired in a way I hadn't noticed before. At school, my students were tracing outlines of their hands for turkey feathers, their laughter bouncing off the windows. It should have been a comforting sound, but all I could hear was my mother's voice telling me not to come home for Thanksgiving. By the time dismissal ended, I had almost convinced myself it didn't matter. But the moment I stepped inside my apartment, the quiet made the truth impossible to ignore. I sat at my kitchen table, the safe still open beside me, its contents spread across the surface like a puzzle I already knew how to solve. Grace's handwriting covered every document, careful and deliberate, her ink pressed deep into the paper. She had built the Grace Whitaker Foundation piece by piece, never speaking of it, never needing applause. My eyes moved over the pages, the board charter, the founding statement, the addendum she'd signed 6 months before her death. She had appointed me as chairman and sole trustee of her estate. But what caught my attention wasn't the money itself. It was the clause written in her unmistakable cursive: "Character will always outweigh appearance. Any act of exclusion based on social standing shall void inheritance rights." That sentence sat heavy in my chest. I remembered Grace sitting at the nursing home window, sunlight catching the edge of her silver hair, saying softly, "People show you who they are when they think no one's looking." She must have known how things would unfold. She must have known this family would eventually test the meaning of worth. 3 nights later, Samantha called. Her number flashed across my phone screen, followed by a text: "Need to talk. Pick up." I stared at it for a long time before answering. Her voice came through bright and crisp, full of the confidence that had always opened doors for her. "I knew Mom would sound harsh," she said. "You know how she gets before holidays." I didn't say anything, just waited. "But you have to understand, Rachel Jonathan's family is different. He's connected to people who can change everything for me. I can't afford any missteps right now. I kept my voice steady. And I'm a misstep. She hesitated, then sighed. You're not but your job, your lifestyle. It's just not the image I need him to see right now. He's used to a certain circle. CEOs, investors, people who make things happen. People who matter, I asked. That's not what I meant. Her voice softened, but it didn't sound like remorse. You wouldn't fit in, that's all. Once we're engaged, once I'm more established, we can ease you in. Small dinners, first introductions, that makes sense. You'll thank me later. I imagined her sitting in her apartment, surrounded by white walls and designer furniture, rehearsing that same tone she used in meetings to sound reasonable while dismissing someone's worth. I won't be there, I said quietly. There was a pause, then the sound of her exhale, short, sharp, final. Good. I was hoping you'd understand. And Rachel, don't show up anyway. I'll have security at the house. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there for a long moment, phone still in hand, until the room felt smaller than it had before. On the counter, the light from the lamp fell across the folder labeled Succession Protocols. I slid it open again, tracing the embossed seal of Grace's initials. Later that night, I logged into the Foundation's secure board portal. There it was, the upcoming annual gala, scheduled for 3 days after Thanksgiving at the Waldorf Grand, 500 guests, full media coverage. I had avoided public events for the past 2 years, preferring the anonymity Grace once valued. But this year would be different. I scrolled to the guest list section, paused, and added 5 names: Linda Morgan, Peter Morgan, Samantha Morgan, plus 2 additional guests. The cursor blinked steady and certain. I closed the laptop and sat back, hearing Grace's voice again. Justice doesn't need an announcement. It just needs timing. The following morning, my friend Megan stopped by my classroom before the first bell. You okay? You've been quiet all week. I told her part of it, just enough to make her frown and shake her head. They don't deserve you, she said softly. But I'm guessing they'll find that out soon enough. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Thanksgiving week arrived. The sky turned the color of tin and a drizzle slicked the sidewalks. The city smelled like roasted nuts and chimney smoke, that familiar mix of warmth and loneliness. I spent the morning grading papers, then walked to Mr. Chen's takeout place down the block. The owner handed me a bag with my usual order orange chicken and lo mein and wished me a happy holiday without noticing the tremor in my smile. That night, I sat at my small table dinner for one, the glow from the streetlight painting soft shadows across the walls. My phone stayed silent until mid-afternoon, when Samantha's name appeared again, this time on social media. Her post showed a dining table set, like something from a magazine, crystal glasses, gold-rimmed china orchids down the center. She stood beside Jonathan, her hand positioned to catch the light on a diamond bracelet. The caption read, "Grateful for family who understand what truly matters." Jonathan's expression in the photo was polite, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. In one picture, he was staring at an empty chair, the one that should have been mine. A message from Megan appeared a few minutes later. "Why aren't you in any of the pictures?" I typed a reply, then deleted it. There was nothing to explain. I finished dinner and cracked open a fortune cookie. It read, "Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet." I slipped the paper into my wallet beside Grace's old note and the gala invitation that waited untouched in its envelope. 3 days left. That Sunday morning, I woke to a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a man's voice spoke steady, professional. "Ms. Morgan, this is Jonathan Hale." For a heartbeat, I said nothing. Then, "Yes, this is Rachel." "I'd like to speak with you," he said. "Privately." I could hear traffic in the background, the muffled sound of city life. "What about—" He hesitated. "About something I saw yesterday." When the call ended, I sat for a long time, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room. Grace used to say that truth has a way of arriving right on schedule. I didn't know what Jonathan had discovered, but I had a feeling it was the first crack in the picture Samantha had tried so hard to paint. By Monday morning, the tension was visible even from a distance. My phone buzzed with messages from my parents, all marked urgent. I ignored them and kept my focus on the children, their voices rising in a chorus of "Over the river and through the woods." But by the time dismissal ended, the pit in my stomach had returned. When I reached home that evening, the pounding on my door nearly made me drop my keys. Through the peephole, I saw my parents standing there, faces, pale eyes wide. I opened the door slowly. "What did you do?" my mother demanded, brushing past me before I could answer. "Excuse me, don't play innocent," she snapped. "Jonathan broke up with Samantha yesterday. In public. At brunch. What did you say to him?" "Nothing," I said truthfully. "He called me." My father's voice boomed behind her. "He walked into the foundation office and saw your portrait hanging there. Chairman of the board." I met his stare. "So that's how he found out." My mother's face tightened. "Why didn't you tell us? How could you hide something like this?" "The same way you hid uninviting me from Thanksgiving," I replied. "That's different," she said quickly. "You embarrassed Samantha. I think she managed that herself." My father's jaw clenched. "You're going to fix this, Rachel. Call him, resign, do whatever it takes." "No," I said quietly. He stepped closer. "I'm not asking. I know." I met his eyes until he looked away. "Come to the Foundation Gala tomorrow night. You'll get all the answers you're looking for." My mother blinked, uncertain. "What gala?" I handed her an envelope, the same one I'd been keeping on my kitchen counter. "The Grace Whittaker Foundation. Annual Gala. Black tie. 8 o'clock. Bring Samantha." They left without another word, the door clicking shut behind them. When their footsteps faded down the hall, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. On the table, the lamplight caught the edge of the invitation, still clutched in my mother's hand. For a moment I thought of Grace again, her voice low and even. "Justice doesn't raise its voice, child. It just waits for its moment." That moment was coming, and by the time the ballroom lights dimmed the next night, every truth they'd buried would be standing in the same room. When I closed the door behind my parents, the silence that followed felt almost unreal. For a moment I just stood there in the hallway, listening to the echo of their footsteps fade down the stairs. Then the stillness folded over me, familiar but heavier than usual. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat by the window, watching the rain smear the city lights. Tomorrow night, every truth that had been buried for years would be standing in the same room. At school the next morning, the children's chatter filled the air as they painted paper snowflakes. The scent of glue and tempera paint mixed with the smell of winter coats drying near the radiator. I moved among their tables, steadying little hands, offering quiet praise and pretending not to feel the tension buzzing in my chest. When the final bell rang, I gathered the drawings into neat stacks and placed them on my desk, the weight of them grounding me. The knock came just as I was putting away brushes. I turned to find Samantha in the doorway, her designer coat damp from the rain. Her mascara was smudged, her eyes red. "We need to talk," she said. Parents were still picking up their children, so I gestured toward the hallway. "Not here." We stepped outside into the gray afternoon. Cars crawled by headlights, streaking across puddles. "How could you do this?" She started, her voice breaking between anger and panic. "Jonathan left me because of you." I kept my tone calm. He came to his own conclusions. "You talked to him," she insisted. "You must have said something." "I didn't," I said simply. "He called me." Her breath came fast, visible in the cold air. "He told me he couldn't be with someone ashamed of her own family. Do you know how that makes me look? After everything I've built, I looked at her, the same sister who once hid behind me during thunderstorms, now trembling for a different reason. Maybe it's not about how it looks. "You don't get to lecture me," she snapped. "You're ruining my life." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. Samantha snatched it from my hand and hit speaker. "She's right here, Mom." My mother's voice came through sharp and anxious. "Rachel, you need to fix this. Call Jonathan. Step down from whatever position you have. We're talking about your sister's entire future." "I'm not resigning," I said. "That's petty," she said, her tone turning brittle. "This family has sacrificed for you. I think Grace sacrificed for all of us," I replied, and she made her choice. My father's voice joined in, deep and insistent. "Be reasonable, Rachel. Samantha worked hard to get where she is. This foundation nonsense," I ended the call. Samantha's mouth fell open. "You can't just hang up on them." "I just did." Her anger cracked then. "I'll contest the will," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll prove you manipulated Grandma." She wasn't in her right mind. "She was sharper than anyone I've ever met," I said quietly. "She had doctors and a judge witness everything." Samantha's face crumpled, tears cutting through her makeup. For a moment, I saw something raw and honest in her expression. "I loved him," she whispered. "Then you should have been honest with him," I said. "Come to the gala tomorrow. Hear what Grace had to say. Then decide what you want to do." She didn't answer. When she turned to leave, her heels splashed through the puddles, each step fading into the sound of traffic. That night, Jonathan called. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that felt like regret. "Ms. Morgan." He began formal at first. "I owe you an apology. I had no idea who you really were." "I'm still a kindergarten teacher," I said. "That's not what I meant," he replied. "Your staff, your principal, they all spoke about you. You've been covering other teachers' supply costs, volunteering on weekends, mentoring students. Your grandmother would be proud." I said nothing. "She told me you were unemployed," he continued, "that you lived off family money. She even said you'd been institutionalized, that the family kept you out of events because you caused scenes." His voice caught slightly. "I believed her. I'm sorry." "Would you have believed me if I'd told you the truth?" I asked. He hesitated. "Probably not." "Then it's better this way," I said. "I know she's been calling you," he went on, "begging for another chance, saying you turned everyone against her, but I see it now. You didn't do anything except exist in a way that threatened her image." "I'm not here to hurt her," I said, "but I won't hide anymore." He was silent for a moment. "You're giving a speech tomorrow night." "Right I am." "Then I'll be there," he said, "and I'll make sure the right people hear it." After we hung up, I sat at my desk, the city lights flickering across the walls. The stack of student art still waited beside me. I picked up one of the drawings, a crooked turkey with the words, "Thank you, Miss Morgan," scrawled in orange marker, and pinned it to the bulletin board. Then I pulled out my speech notes, each page covered in neat handwritten lines. Grace's handwriting stared back at me from the margins of her old letter, "Stand up for what's right, even if you stand alone." It was well past midnight when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole I saw Samantha again, still in her coat hair damp from the drizzle. I opened the door without a word. She stepped inside, scanning my apartment like she was seeing it for the first time. The modest furniture, the children's drawings, the photos of Grace. "Nice place," she said. Finally, her voice edged with something between sarcasm and discomfort. "Very you." I waited. "I know about the inheritance," she said. $15 million. 3 properties. It's all in the will, isn't it?" My stomach tightened. "How would you know that I have friends at Whitaker and Bennett?" she said quickly. "I know what Grandma left. And I'm the rightful heir, Rachel. I'm the one who can represent this family for what I asked." More handbags. Another title. Her eyes flashed. "Do you understand what kind of circles I move in? The people I have to keep up with? You wouldn't last 5 minutes in that world. I'm not trying to." She paced across the small living room, her voice rising. "God, you sound just like her, always judging me for wanting more." "She never judged you, Sam. She just saw you." "What does that mean?" I met her eyes. "Come tomorrow night. You'll understand." She stopped pacing, her tone softening, almost pleading. "Or we could make a deal. You resign from the foundation, support my claim to the inheritance, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. $1 million tax-free. No $2 million. Grace left a video message for the gala," I said quietly. Her face drained of color. "What kind of message?" "The kind that explains everything." She stood frozen, her breath uneven. "You've seen it tomorrow, everyone will." She turned toward the door, hand trembling on the knob. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." When she was gone, the scent of her perfume lingered in the air, sharp and expensive, like every room she tried to own. I sat back down at the table, my notes spread out in front of me, the clock ticking steady on the wall. The weight of what was coming pressed against me, but underneath it all was something quieter certainty. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of day where the sky feels close enough to touch. I stopped by school early, long before the children arrived, and sat at my desk. Grace's photo rested beside the lesson plans. I studied her familiar smile, the calm behind her eyes, and whispered, "I hope I'm doing this right." When I looked up, the classroom door stood open to the hallway where a new day waited on the other side. Tomorrow, there would be no pretending left for anyone. The morning of the gala arrived gray and still, the kind of quiet that feels like the city is holding its breath. I sat in my classroom before the first bell, the photo of Grace on my desk, catching the light from the window. The children wouldn't arrive for another hour, but I needed the calm before the day carried me forward. I traced the edge of the frame and thought about the last Sunday we'd spent together, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. Money reveals character. Rachel, it doesn't change it. By noon, the rest of the world had begun to move faster. My phone buzzed constantly, texts, missed calls, messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Word about the family argument had started spreading the way news always does in families that value appearances more than privacy. Cousins I barely remembered wanted my side. I ignored them all. The only message I opened came from Arthur Bennett. "Board meeting at 3. Please come by early." When I reached his office, the conference room was already prepared. Files lined the polished table, color-coded and precise, just like Grace had always liked things. Arthur stood near the window adjusting his glasses. "You're early," he said. "That's good. We have work to do." He handed me a folder thick with documents. Your grandmother anticipated nearly every outcome, he explained. She recorded her message 6 months before her passing. 3 witnesses were present, me, Dr. Patterson, and Judge Reynolds. All of us verified her state of mind. I glanced down at the paperwork, her will board resolutions, proof of her cognitive exams. Each signature was another layer of protection, one more way she'd ensured no one could twist her intentions. The other board members filtered in one by one. There was Mrs. Stone, who ran literacy programs across the city, Dr. Williams, who managed the foundation's medical grants, and Maria Rodriguez, a social worker who'd worked with Grace for over a decade. Their faces softened when they saw me. "Your grandmother chose wisely," Mrs. Stone said quietly. "We're with you." Arthur tapped his pen against the table. "The video will be played tonight," he said. "The legal documents will follow immediately after. If your sister challenges the will, this," he lifted a sealed envelope, "will end the argument in minutes." "What's in it?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "I don't know. Grace sealed it herself. She called it her final insurance policy." I slid the envelope into my briefcase, the weight of it both comforting and heavy. "What if Samantha causes a scene?" "She will," Arthur said. "But you just have to stand still. Truth doesn't need to shout." By late afternoon, the city had turned gold with sunset. I went home to change, laying out the navy dress Megan had loaned me. It wasn't designer, just simple and well-made. I pinned a small silver brooch to the neckline, a gift from Grace years ago, shaped like an open book. The mirror showed a reflection I barely recognized. The nervous teacher from Queens was still there, but she carried herself differently now, as if Grace's steadiness had found a home in her. Megan arrived to help with my hair curling loose strands around my shoulders. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked. "I have to be," I said. "Then you're more like your grandmother than you think." She smiled and stepped back, studying her work. "You look perfect." By the time I reached the Waldorf Grand, the lobby was already glowing with chandeliers and the low hum of expensive conversation. Staff in black uniforms guided guests toward the ballroom where tables gleamed under soft lighting. The scent of flowers filled the air, white lilies and roses, Grace's favorites. Arthur met me near the entrance, his expression unreadable. "The press is here," he said. "The Times, the Journal. 2 local stations. Word of an announcement has them curious." "I know," I said. "Your family's here too. They arrived 20 minutes ago." Front table. My chest tightened, but I nodded. Across the room, I spotted them easily. Samantha in a scarlet gown that caught every glimmer of light, our mother in pearls, our father stiff in his tuxedo. They looked perfectly composed, the picture of elegance, if not for the tension I could see in their shoulders. "Ready?" Arthur asked. "As I'll ever be." The next hour moved like slow motion. Guests mingled, waiters circled with champagne, and conversations buzzed around me. I shook hands, smiled for cameras, listened to stories from people whose lives Grace had changed. There were teachers who'd received grants, social workers who'd been able to keep their programs running, and young professionals who'd gotten their first scholarships through the foundation. Every one of them spoke of Grace with the kind of affection that filled the empty space her absence had left behind. When dinner began, I took my seat at the head table. Samantha was positioned directly across from me. She looked radiant and restless, her smile stretched too tight. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting. Halfway through the meal, she stood up, tapping her spoon against her glass. The room quieted immediately. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said with a laugh that carried just a little too far. "But I simply can't wait to share something wonderful." Arthur's jaw tightened. "This isn't on the program," he murmured. Samantha smiled at the crowd. "As many of you know, I'm Samantha Morgan, Grace Whitaker's granddaughter. I'm thrilled to announce that I'll be joining the foundation in a leadership role. It's an honor to continue her legacy." A murmur swept the room. Cameras turned toward her. At the next table, Jonathan Hale rose slowly, his expression controlled, but his voice firm. "Samantha," he said, "that's not true." Her smile faltered. "Oh, Jonathan, you're too modest." "I'm not being modest," he replied evenly. "You're not part of the foundation." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Reporters leaned forward. The air felt electric. Samantha's composure cracked for the briefest second before she pointed toward me. "This is her doing," she said, voice sharp now. "She's manipulated everyone, taken advantage of an old woman's trust." Arthur whispered something into his phone, security most likely, but I lifted a hand to stop him. "Let her speak," I said. She turned on me, her voice trembling with anger. "You're nothing, Rachel. A school teacher who makes less than my watch costs. You embarrassed this family for years, and now you think you can take everything." I rose slowly, my heartbeat steady. "Are you finished?" The room had gone silent except for the quiet hum of cameras recording every word. Samantha's eyes were glassy with fury. "You're an embarrassment," she hissed. "You're everything our family isn't supposed to be." I walked toward the podium. The lights caught the edge of my brooch, and I felt Grace beside me. "Thank you, Samantha," I said into the microphone. That was the perfect introduction. The foundation's logo appeared on the large screen behind me. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady, despite the storm around me. "I'm Rachel Morgan, chairman of the board of the Grace Whitaker Foundation. For those who don't know me, I teach kindergarten in Queens." A ripple moved through the audience, surprise, then curiosity. "My grandmother built this foundation over 40 years ago," I continued. "She believed in quiet work and in helping people who never expected recognition. Tonight, we honor that belief by sharing her final message." The lights dimmed slightly. I pressed the remote Arthur had given me. The screen flickered, then filled with Grace's face, calm, clear-eyed, unmistakably alive, in that moment 6 months before she passed. A hush fell over the room. "If you're watching this," Grace's recorded voice said, "then something has happened that requires clarity." The crowd leaned forward. I glanced at Samantha. She was pale, her lips pressed tight. Grace continued, her tone even but firm. "My estate, including the foundation, 3 properties and all assets, will go to the beneficiary who lives by the values I hold dear: kindness, honesty, and respect for every working person. Any act of discrimination or exclusion based on profession or social status will void that inheritance immediately." The audience murmured, recognizing the weight of her words. Grace paused, her gaze direct. "If my granddaughter Samantha has excluded her sister Rachel because of her career as a teacher, then she has failed this test." A collective gasp moved through the room. Samantha stood suddenly, shaking her head. "This is fake," she shouted. "It's not," said a man's voice from the crowd. Judge Reynolds stood from his table. "I witnessed the recording myself." Grace's face returned to the screen. "In that case," she said softly, "the inheritance transfers to my granddaughter Rachel, whose work reminds us all that dignity isn't determined by wealth." The room erupted, reporters whispering, cameras flashing, guests turning in shock. I stood perfectly still. Samantha lunged toward the screen, her voice breaking. "You can't do this. This is a lie." Security stepped forward, but I shook my head again. "It's done," I said quietly. Grace's image faded from the screen, leaving only the foundation logo behind. Arthur took the podium next, his tone crisp and professional. As executor of Grace Whitaker's estate, I can confirm the validity of this recording. The will has been reviewed by the court and upheld by multiple legal teams. Effective immediately, all assets transfer to Rachel Morgan. My mother covered her mouth. My father stared at the floor. Samantha sank into her chair, her shoulders shaking. I turned back to the crowd. Grace wanted tonight to be about her mission, not about money, I said. So let's continue in her honor. The applause began hesitantly at first, then grew steady and genuine. I looked toward the back of the ballroom where Jonathan stood watching quietly. His expression wasn't pity, it was respect. As the lights rose and guests began to talk again, Arthur leaned toward me. "You handled that with grace," he said softly. I smiled faintly. She taught me how. The night wasn't over. The real reckoning would come after the applause faded, when the cameras stopped rolling and the silence returned. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. The truth had found its voice, and there was no going back. When the applause finally faded and the ballroom lights came up, the sound that replaced it wasn't silence, it was chaos. Reporters were shouting questions, cameras flashing, and I could feel the weight of every lens pointed at my family. Samantha sat stiffly in her chair, tears streaking her makeup, while my mother's hands trembled against her pearls. My father's face was ashen, a man watching the story he'd built around his family collapse in real time. Arthur stepped forward quietly, directing security to usher the press back toward the lobby, but the flashes kept coming. Jonathan was still at his table, calm and steady in a way that made the moment seem less unbearable. He caught my eye, gave a small nod, then turned to one of his staff and gestured toward the exit. He knew this wasn't a victory parade, it was a reckoning. When the last guest left and the cameras were escorted out, I finally exhaled. The chandelier light dimmed to a soft glow as Arthur gathered the remaining documents from the podium. "That went about as well as it could have," he said, though his tone was weary. "Grace would have been proud." Samantha rose slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You humiliated me. You did that yourself," my father said sharply, the first time I'd ever heard him speak to her without indulgence. His tone stopped her mid-step. "I was trying to build a future for all of us," she said, eyes wide and pleading. "You think this foundation means anything without me? I was supposed to be its face." Arthur's expression hardened. "You might want to be careful, Ms. Morgan. The live stream feed captured everything, including your statements tonight." My mother turned toward me, voice cracking. "Please, Rachel, stop this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I said quietly. "Grace made her choice long before tonight." Samantha's anger flared again. "You've always been jealous." I met her eyes and shook my head. "No, Samantha. I just learned to stop apologizing for being enough." For a moment, the air between us felt heavy with all the years we'd spent pretending to be a family. Then my father straightened his jacket and said flatly, "Let's go." He didn't look back as he walked toward the door. My mother followed after him, glancing over her shoulder once before disappearing into the corridor. Samantha stayed frozen in place, hands trembling around the stem of her untouched champagne glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. "You think this makes you better than me?" "No," I said. "It just makes me free." I turned away before I could see her break again. Outside the ballroom, the hallway smelled of lilies and cold air. Jonathan waited near the elevators, his coat draped over one arm. "I didn't know she could lie like that," he said quietly. "She thought lies were armor," I replied. "They just broke faster." He gave a faint smile. "You handled that with grace, no pun intended." "Thank you," I said, meaning it. "Listen," he added, "if the press reaches out to you for comment, I can help filter requests through my PR team. You don't owe them your story." "I'll think about it," I said, though I already knew I wanted silence more than anything. The night outside was sharp with winter. The city felt different, both too bright and strangely calm. As I stepped into a waiting cab, I caught my reflection in the window. My grandmother's brooch still glimmered under the lights, the open book shining faintly against the navy fabric. The following morning, the headlines had already begun. Socialite disinherited over Thanksgiving snub. Teacher named heir to $15 million foundation. My phone filled with messages from journalists, old classmates, and relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. I ignored every one of them. Megan showed up at my apartment that evening, still in her school clothes, holding a grocery bag full of takeout. "You're trending," she said, setting the food down on the counter. "The kids' parents are already talking about you at pickup." I laughed softly. Great, just what I needed, celebrity status among 5-year-olds. We sat at my kitchen table, eating quietly for a while. Then she said, "Your grandmother really thought this through, didn't she?" "She did," I said. "She just waited for the right time." Megan nodded slowly. "Well, I'm proud of you." That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, I admitted, but it was necessary. A week passed before my parents reached out again. My father's email was short. "We need to talk, for everyone's sake." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them at a quiet cafe in Midtown. When I arrived, they were already seated, both looking years older than they had at the gala. My mother's voice trembled as she spoke. "We didn't see what we were doing to you, Rachel. We thought we were helping." My father kept his eyes down. "We failed both of you," he said. "Your grandmother tried to warn us." I listened, unsure whether to believe them. "What do you want from me?" "We want to make it right," my mother said. "Therapy. All of us." I studied them for a long moment. "If you're serious, I'll join you. But it has to be real. No excuses." They both nodded. A week later, we met Dr. Eleanor Kim for the first time. Her office was soft and simple, lined with books and the faint scent of cedar. She spoke gently but directly, guiding the conversation away from blame and toward accountability. My parents talked about their fears of failure, of appearances, of losing control. For the first time, I saw how much of their behavior had been driven by insecurity rather than cruelty. It didn't excuse it, but it explained the cracks. Samantha didn't come. Every week, Dr. Kim left an open chair at the end of the circle just in case. It stayed empty for months. During that time, the foundation became my new center of gravity. Arthur and I met regularly to plan the transition, ensuring Grace's programs continued without disruption. Jonathan rejoined the board as a partner representative, offering quiet support whenever the public scrutiny grew loud. Reporters tried to paint the story as scandal, but donors saw something else, a renewal of purpose. Within a month, contributions had doubled. The night the first round of teacher grants went out, I sat in my classroom long after dark, reading through letters from educators across the city. One wrote about paying for her students' meals out of her own pocket. Another thanked us for covering her classroom repairs after a flood. Every envelope felt like a message from Grace herself. Keep going. It was nearly midnight when I left the school. Snow had started to fall soft and steady, covering the sidewalks like forgiveness. I walked the 4 blocks home without gloves, letting the cold sting my hands. Somewhere deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. Samantha had vanished from social media, her company ties unraveling day by day. I didn't wish her harm, but I couldn't save her either. When I reached my building, I found a small envelope taped to my door. My name was written across it in familiar looping handwriting. Inside was a single line, "You don't get to rewrite history." No signature, but I didn't need one. I stood there in the hallway, reading it twice, the sound of wind pushing against the windows. Then I folded the note and tucked it into my coat pocket. Grace used to say that truth always collects its own witnesses. I wasn't afraid of being seen anymore. The next morning, Arthur called to tell me a tabloid had picked up another rumor, something about family betrayal and inheritance intrigue. He was calm about it, almost amused. "Let them write," he said. "Facts always catch up." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of Samantha's reach. Somewhere she was waiting for her next move, the kind that would either destroy what little was left or finally bring her peace. And deep down, I hoped it would be the latter. Because for the first time in years, I was standing in the life Grace had built for me, a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. But peace, I was learning, always comes with a cost. Winter in New York always has a way of pressing down on you. The light comes late, the air bites, and everything seems quieter than it should be. In the weeks after that note appeared on my door, I started to notice the silence more than usual, the kind that feels like someone's standing just beyond it. I changed the locks, added a camera above the entryway, and left the porch light on every night. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that Samantha's anger hadn't finished its work. At school, I kept things steady for my students. They were rehearsing for the winter concert all bundled in scarves and reindeer sweaters. Their laughter filled the classroom, bright and grounding, pulling me out of my thoughts for hours at a time. But the moment I walked home through the early darkness, the unease returned like clockwork. A week later, Arthur called. "Rachel," he said, his tone calm but firm. "There's been a development. Samantha's filed a temporary motion contesting the will. She's claiming emotional coercion and mental duress." I sank into the nearest chair. "Can she do that?" "She can try," he replied. "But her claim won't hold. Grace's documentation is airtight. Still, it means court appearances, depositions, and press attention. I'll handle most of it. You just keep your head down." That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope Samantha had left, the one that said, "I didn't get to rewrite history." I realized then that this wasn't about money anymore. It was about control. The story she told herself couldn't survive the truth, and she was willing to destroy what was left of us to keep it intact. When I told Dr. Kim during our next session, she nodded thoughtfully. "Grief doesn't always come dressed as sadness," she said. "Sometimes it looks like war." My parents sat beside me in silence. My mother twisted a tissue in her hands until it shredded. "We created this," she whispered. We made her think worth and wealth were the same thing. Dr. Kim leaned forward gently. "And now you have the chance to show her otherwise, but you'll need to stop protecting her. That was harder than I expected. For most of my life, protecting Samantha had been second nature, diffusing her temper, covering for her mistakes, softening her words so others wouldn't turn away. Grace had once warned me that kindness without boundaries becomes submission. I hadn't understood that until now. A week before the court hearing, a tabloid published a story claiming I had manipulated Grace into cutting Samantha out of her will. The article was full of half-truths and unnamed family insiders. My phone started ringing nonstop again, but this time the Foundation's PR team, Jonathan's people, intercepted the flood. They issued a quiet, factual statement confirming the legal record. I never had to speak. Still, it stung. Seeing my grandmother's name dragged into headlines felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. I stayed off social media, ignored the gossip, and poured myself into work. When my students performed their winter concert, tiny voices singing, "This Little Light of Mine," something in me eased for the first time in weeks. Grace would have smiled at that. The hearing took place on a Friday morning in early February. The courthouse smelled of old paper and polished wood. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to the gala, the silver brooch pinned just above my heart. Arthur walked beside me through the marble corridor. "Remember," he said quietly, "you don't need to win a fight that's already been decided." Inside, Samantha sat at the opposing table flanked by two lawyers who looked barely old enough to rent a car. Her face was pale, her posture rigid. When our eyes met, she looked away. My parents were seated in the gallery behind me, my mother clutching a tissue again, my father's expression unreadable. The judge listened patiently as Samantha's attorney spoke about family manipulation and emotional pressure. None of it held weight. When Arthur presented the original documents, videos, signatures, medical affidavits, the courtroom grew silent. Then he handed the judge a sealed envelope, Grace's final insurance policy. The judge opened it, read quietly for a moment, and then nodded. "Motion denied," he said. "The will stands as written." Samantha didn't move at first. She just sat there blinking hard, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed through the room like a door closing. Outside, the wind was sharp and cold. Reporters waited on the steps, microphones outstretched. Arthur stepped in front of me, shielding me, as we walked toward the waiting car. I heard Samantha call my name once faintly, but I didn't turn around. That night, I found another envelope in my mailbox. This one wasn't threatening. It was folded neatly, her handwriting smaller, more careful. Inside was a single page. I didn't understand what I was doing. I just couldn't stand being the failure. You got her love, and I got the performance. I don't know how to undo that. I read it twice before setting it down. I didn't know if she meant it as an apology or a confession. Maybe both. In therapy that week, my mother broke down halfway through the session. I thought I was helping them. she said through tears. One daughter with security, one with heart. I thought that would balance the scales. Dr. Kim's voice was gentle. You taught them what to value, Linda. Now you can choose to teach something different. Afterward, my father offered to walk me home. We moved slowly through the cold, the streets quiet under a dusting of snow. You remind me of your grandmother, he said after a while. She never needed to prove herself. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that in you. I didn't answer, but I slipped my hand through his arm. It was the closest we'd been in years. Spring came late that year. The city thawed slowly, and with it so did the air between us. My mother started volunteering twice a week at one of the Foundation's literacy programs. My father began consulting with the Financial Outreach Division. They didn't say it out loud, but I could tell they were trying to rebuild in the only way they knew how, through quiet, consistent work. As for Samantha, the headlines faded, her name slipping further from public view. One afternoon, Arthur mentioned she'd taken a job at a community outreach nonprofit across the river. Entry-level position, he said. Small paycheck, big heart. Maybe she's finally learning. I didn't know whether to believe it, but I hoped it was true. On the anniversary of Grace's passing, I hosted a small gathering at the Foundation, a quiet remembrance for staff donors and students who'd benefited from her programs. Jonathan helped set up the display table, arranging photographs of Grace with the people she'd helped. At the center, I placed her favorite quote in a simple silver frame: "Dignity isn't granted by others, it's lived." When the evening ended and the room emptied, I stood alone by the window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered under the spring sky, and for the first time in a long time, the view felt peaceful. I thought about the note Samantha had written, the one still tucked away in my desk. Maybe some stories don't end cleanly. They just soften at the edges. Maybe that's enough. As I turned off the lights and locked the doors behind me, I realized I was no longer waiting for forgiveness or approval. Grace had given me something far stronger, a life defined by its own truth. But the real test I knew was still coming. Because healing doesn't stop at justice, it starts with what comes after. And sometimes that part is the hardest of all. Spring turned into summer, and with it the rhythm of my days softened into something steady. The school year ended with small hugs, handmade cards, and a classroom that smelled faintly of crayons and sunscreen. My students left with backpacks heavier than their shoulders could carry, and smiles that still found me in the hallways long after. It should have been an ordinary June, but nothing about life felt ordinary anymore. The Foundation had grown beyond anything Grace might have imagined. The board meetings were fuller, the grant applications more ambitious, and for the first time, I felt her presence not as a shadow, but as a steady pulse beneath everything I touched. Arthur managed the legal end with quiet precision, while Jonathan handled the public face, his calm under scrutiny, balancing my preference for staying behind the curtain. Together, we'd turned what began as a legacy into something alive. But even with all that progress, part of me waited for the other shoe to drop. For months, I'd checked my mail every evening, half expecting another letter from Samantha. None came. Then one Thursday morning in July, as I was leaving the Foundation office, the receptionist stopped me. "Someone left this for you," she said, handing over a cream-colored envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was a short note: "I've been volunteering at the Outreach Center. There's a fundraiser next week. I'd like you to come." No press, no audience, just us. I read it twice, then tucked it into my purse without replying. For days, I couldn't decide whether to go. Dr. Kim encouraged it, saying, "Closure doesn't mean forgiveness. It just means understanding what the wound taught you." I didn't know if I was ready for either. Still, the following Friday, I found myself standing outside the small community hall near the East River. It was a modest building, brick walls, worn steps, a banner that read, "Outreach for all families." Inside, I heard the hum of quiet conversation and the clink of serving trays. When I stepped through the door, the smell of fresh bread and soup wrapped around me. Samantha stood behind a folding table wearing an apron over a simple blouse. Her hair was pulled back, her face free of makeup. For a moment, she didn't notice me. She was pouring lemonade for a group of children and laughing softly at something one of them said. It was such a simple scene, but something in it cracked open a space I didn't realize was still closed. When she finally looked up, her smile faltered. "You came," she said, almost in disbelief. "I wasn't sure I would," I admitted. "I wasn't sure you should," she said quietly, "but I needed to try." She led me to a corner table where 2 steaming bowls of soup waited. "It's not the Waldorf," she said with a small, uncertain laugh. "I like this better," I replied. For a while, we just ate in silence. The room buzzed around us, volunteers serving food, kids chasing one another between tables, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Finally, she spoke. "I thought money could make people respect me. When I lost it, I realized how empty that kind of power really is. I looked at her, really looked, and saw someone different from the woman who had stood in front of that ballroom months ago. Grace tried to teach us that," I said. "It just took us different roads to hear it." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I've been working here for 3 months. It's not glamorous, and I'm broke most days, but it's honest. It feels good to wake up and not have to perform." "I'm glad," I said softly. She hesitated before reaching into her bag and pulling out a small envelope. "This was in Grandma's things. Arthur said it was mine, but I couldn't keep it." She slid it across the table. Inside was a faded photograph Grace holding both of us as children, her smile broad and proud. On the back she'd written in her looping hand, "My girls, the heart and the voice." Samantha looked down, her tears spilling quietly. I think she knew we'd have to lose each other before we could find each other again. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. Instead, I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. For the first time, she didn't pull away. When the event ended, we stepped outside together. The sun was setting over the water, streaking the sky with orange and gold. The city looked softer in that light, as if it too was exhaling after a long winter. "I don't expect us to be close again," she said as we stood on the steps, "but I want to stop being enemies." "That's a good place to start," I said. She smiled faintly. "If I ever make something of myself again, I'll make sure it's because I earned it." "You already are," I told her. The next morning, I found a message from Jonathan waiting in my inbox. "Heard about the outreach event. Samantha asked me to make a small donation in your grandmother's name. Hope that's okay?" I smiled as I read it, realizing she hadn't told me about it on purpose. Maybe that was her way of learning humility, doing something good without needing credit. Later that week, the foundation hosted its summer gala, smaller than the winter event, but just as meaningful. This time, I took the podium not as an heir or a symbol, but as a teacher speaking for the people Grace had always fought for. The ballroom wasn't filled with socialites or reporters. It was filled with educators, nurses, and single parents who'd benefited from our grants. When I finished my speech, the room stood in quiet applause. It wasn't thunderous like before, just warm, honest, and real. Jonathan approached with a glass of sparkling water and a smile. "You've found your rhythm," he said. "I think I've found my peace," I replied. As the evening wound down, my parents joined me at the table. My mother's eyes were red, though she was smiling. "You've turned this family's shame into something beautiful," she said softly. "I'm proud of you, Rachel." My father nodded. Grace would be too. The music played low as we watched people laugh and dance. For the first time, the air between us felt light, free of the old weight that used to fill every silence. That night, as I left the hotel, I walked through the city with my heels in my hand and the sound of summer humming around me. I passed a newsstand, the front page showing a small article about the foundation's newest scholarship program. Beneath the headline was a photograph of one of my students holding a book almost as big as his arms. I paused there for a moment, smiling at the thought that maybe the story had finally found its balance. The ones who had once turned away from me were learning to look inward instead, and the life I had built steady, grounded, whole, wasn't something anyone could take anymore. But even then, I felt there was one more chapter left to live. Because sometimes justice doesn't end with victory. It ends with grace finding its way home. The summer faded into early autumn, and for the first time in years, life felt settled. The air turned crisp, children returned to school, and the rhythm of ordinary days began to carry its own quiet comfort. I taught my new class of kindergartners how to hold pencils and share crayons while the foundation continued to grow rooted in the same steady purpose my grandmother had planted decades ago. Every week, I saw her reflection in the work we did in every teacher's letter, every child's smile, every small moment of dignity restored. Samantha and I kept in touch carefully, almost cautiously at first. She would send a photo from the food bank where she volunteered, or a quick note about a new project she was helping organize. She never asked for money or favors, and I never offered. What she wanted this time wasn't charity, it was a chance to build something real. And slowly she was doing just that. One Sunday afternoon, she called to tell me she'd been offered a full-time position coordinating donor relations at the same outreach center. I could hear both pride and disbelief in her voice. "It's not glamorous," she said, "but it finally feels honest." My parents continued their therapy with Dr. Kim. The sessions weren't always easy, but they kept showing up even when it meant facing their own mistakes. My father began teaching weekend financial workshops at one of the foundation's partner centers. My mother organized reading circles for parents learning English. They no longer spoke about reputation or appearances, only about progress, about how they could still become the kind of people Grace would have respected. Seeing them choose humility after so many years of pride was its own kind of healing. Jonathan remained my closest ally at the foundation. Together, we expanded the Equal Dignity Initiative nationwide. Teachers from across the country began writing to us sharing stories of classrooms saved and communities revived. Sometimes after long board meetings, we'd stay behind sipping tea in the quiet office, talking about Grace's vision and how simple her belief really was that everyone deserves to be seen. Those conversations reminded me that justice isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about restoration, about creating space for truth to live and breathe. By winter, we launched a new branch of the Foundation's work scholarships for first-generation college students in education and social work. Each award letter carried the same quote my grandmother had once written on the back of that old photograph, "The heart and the voice." It felt like her blessing carried forward past from one generation to the next. The following Thanksgiving, the first since everything changed, I decided to host dinner at my apartment. It wasn't grand, just my parents, Samantha, Megan, and Jonathan. We used mismatched plates and the table barely fit everyone, but laughter filled every inch of space. Samantha helped set the table. My mother baked the sweet potatoes, and my father poured cider instead of wine. At one point, Samantha raised her glass. To Grace, she said softly, "For teaching us that the measure of a family isn't in what it owns, but in how it learns." We sat there for a moment, letting her words linger. The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was warm, full of understanding. That night, when everyone left, I stood at the window watching the city lights flicker below and thought about the long road that had brought us there. A year ago, I'd been the daughter no one wanted at the table, the one they thought was an embarrassment too small, too ordinary to matter. Now, the same family that had turned me away was learning what real worth meant. Not the kind you can spend or display, but the kind you earn by standing firm when the world tells you to shrink. Grace's portrait hangs in the foundation lobby now. Every morning, I stop to look at it before heading to my classroom. It reminds me that the fight for dignity doesn't end when justice is served. It continues in the quiet work that follows. The legacy she left wasn't just money. It was a blueprint for courage, a lesson in how to hold your head high even when others doubt your place. Sometimes my students ask why I still teach when I could just be the boss. I always smile and tell them the truth. Because the classroom is where hope begins. Because teaching children to read is how you teach them to see the world differently. Because the work that looks small to others often changes everything in ways they'll never notice. One evening, as I locked up the foundation after a long day, I found a small envelope taped to my office door. Inside was a handwritten note from Samantha. "Thank you for not giving up on the idea that I could still be more than my mistakes." Underneath, she'd drawn a small heart and signed it simply, "Your sister." I tucked it into my desk drawer beside Grace's photograph. For the first time, I truly understood what my grandmother had meant when she said, "Patience is the soil where justice grows." The lesson wasn't about winning or proving anyone wrong. It was about staying rooted in your own worth long enough for the truth to bloom. If you've ever been made to feel small for the life you've chosen, for being gentle, steady, or ordinary, remember this: dignity doesn't ask for permission. It lives quietly inside you, waiting for you to stand beside it. And if this story speaks to you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs reminding that kindness is strength. Because in the end, that's what Grace wanted all along, for us to keep passing the lesson forward. One life, one story, one act of quiet courage at a time.